They came from the east. The barbarians who destroyed Rome, the greatest empire the world had ever seen. For 1,500 years, their names have been bywords for mindless brutality. The Huns, the Vandals, the Goths, history's Hell's Angels, our ancestors. The books tell us the barbarians created a time of darkness and chaos. That this age was simply a gap between the glory of Rome and the rebirth of Europe in the Middle Ages. But I believe the truth was rather different.
I suspect we've been misled by the few surviving records from the Dark Ages. I believe that we owe much more to the barbarians than we realise.
Scattered across Europe are precious clues to the world they made. In this series, I'm going in search of our elusive ancestors. I believe their reputation as history's Hell's Angels is no more than Roman propaganda. I want to find out who they really were. But first, I want to try to solve the mystery of why their legacy has remained hidden for so long. Here at Hadrian's Wall, there's a clue to why we are so ignorant of our barbarian heritage. These stones record the lives and deaths of men who served here at the end of empire, at the beginnings of what we call the Dark Ages. Here's a Roman memorial for a Roman soldier, sacred to the memory of the departed Dagvalda, soldier of the first cohort of Pannonians. Pannonia is in present-day Hungary, which means Dagvalda was not born a Roman, he was born a barbarian. And he's not the only one. When you look closer at these weathered Roman inscriptions, you can see that very few of these Roman soldiers came from Rome at all. Most were born barbarians. But when Dagvalda's widow put up this memorial to him, she stressed his Roman connections. She all but ignored his barbarian roots. It's no wonder we're ignorant of barbarian life.
It's 1,600 years since the Romans left Britain. But even today, if we want to express power and stability, if we want to reflect authority and wealth, we defer to a classical age. We imitate the Romans.
And we don't just copy their buildings. Like Dagvalda's widow, we still venerate Roman culture. For centuries, Latin was at the centre of European education and religion. So it's not surprising that it's always been assumed the people who destroyed the Roman Empire were simply ignorant savages. But I'm convinced that barbarian societies must have been as complex as any other.
When the barbarians overran the Roman Empire, they would have brought with them ideas, ways of relating to each other, and systems of justice.
Finding evidence of what that culture was is going to be difficult. All the accounts that have come down to us about the fall of Rome were written by Romans and their allies. It's a one-sided story. To the Romans, the barbarians were ignorant, savage, and uncivilized. To the Romans, a barbarian was just a barbarian. If I'm to truly understand the barbarian point of view, then the evidence I'm looking for will have to be different.
Here, in Britain, there's only one place to start.
What would the barbarians have made of the kind of people who could create a structure like this, 20 feet high and 70 miles long? There's very little evidence that they wanted to invade this part of the empire. So what was the wall for?
It would have been quite an impressive thing. It showed the might of the Roman Empire to the barbarians, but also, I suspect, also to the soldiers as well. This was a seriously big engineering feat, something they'd been involved in building for the greater glory of Rome. Hadrian was not a man who wanted to go on expanding the Roman Empire at all. He wanted to call a halt, and he wanted to have a clear barrier which says, this is Roman territory, that is not Roman territory.
It was a cultural line too. On this side of the wall, for thousands of miles, stretched a vast and secure empire. To be a Roman, even to be part of the Roman Empire, meant you belonged to an extremely powerful club. You were part of the most powerful society on earth.
At the heart of this society was the army. Without the army, the empire was nothing. Had they left anything behind?
Have any weapons been found on the wall?
Remarkably few, because obviously soldiers were looking after their weapons, they were expected to. But yes, we do have the odd piece, particularly of bows, composite bows. For example, we have a little tiny piece here, and this is the top of a bow. It's called an earlath. And this goes at the very end of the bow, takes the string through here. And this is a very important part of the bow because it not only strengthens the bow, but it also helps it to be efficient, helps it to be fast and accurate.
And this presumably was a Roman invention?
No. Archery, this sort of use of a composite bow, is something which came into the Roman Empire from the East. It's the Romans adapting and adopting other people's technology.
Barbarian technology. What's special about this eastern bow is that the end is carved out of horn, so the string can be pulled back harder and further. With this innovation, they had transformed the simple bow and arrow into a weapon that won wars. So right at the heart of the imperial war machine lies evidence of the skill and ingenuity of the barbarians. But that's not the only reason why, in unravelling the mystery of the Dark Ages, this bow could be a valuable clue. For the Romans, this was simply an efficient piece of military technology, and that's the way it looks to us today. But it was much more than that for the barbarians from the East. To them, it was a cultural icon, and for me, as an anthropologist, it's a rare physical object that gives us an insight into the barbarian worldview. It's a way into the minds of our hidden ancestors. This is how the bow would have been fired. To acquire the skills of the nomadic warriors of the Dark Ages has taken Koshoi Loyosh many years. He's tried to understand their culture from the inside, but I still can't imagine what that feels like.
If you do something your ancestors did, you can come closer. Closer and closer. If I don't use the bow and don't sit on the horse, no contact. But I do every day, 2 times a day. It's a little bit closer and closer, and I can thinking about the past. I sit on the yurt, make a fire. Same. 2,000 years ago, the people say, shoot from the horse. I think it's a little bit closer. The warrior life depends on the horse. It was very close.
These nomadic warriors were individualists and wedded to their horses. Man and horse together, even in death.
First dig a grave for the man, after dig a grave for the horse, and put the saddle and every bridle, everything on the horse, and put the horse in the grave and shoot the horse. And there are many balls in the graveyard.
Spending time with Lajos gives me glimpses of the barbarian mind. I can see what a very different universe these individualistic guerrilla warriors inhabited from the centralized and hierarchical world of the Roman legionary. Lajos's passion and commitment is one way into their world, but I need something more tangible. My journey through the Dark Ages starts in the very last days of Empire, the beginning of the 5th century. That was the time the Romans made this extraordinary map. Stretching from Britannia in the west to China in the east, it's really a diagram of the world they knew. With all roads leading to Rome, it combines the simplicity of a tube map with the detail of a route planner. I'm taking it with me as a constant reminder of why we know more about the Romans than we do about the barbarians. No barbarian map survives. We don't even know if they ever made any. And this might have been the shape of our world today, except for a momentous event that happened in the dead of winter in the year 406. It happened at the most important frontier in Roman Europe, the Rhine. It was here that Rome's most important barrier collapsed. The dam holding back the barbarians burst. For the people of Europe, life would never be the same again. At the beginning of the 5th century, migrating Germanic tribes were on the move across the European plains towards the Roman world. And it was here, at the River Rhine, that they reached the edge of empire. For these migrating peoples, it was a barrier to be crossed, then forgotten. Like Hadrian's Wall, it was guarded by forts and defended by troops. But it was under far more pressure. The enemy was trying to get in.
This was a frontier town. Behind me, Pax Romana, and in front of me, Germania. This is the place where the barbarians arrived.
The Romans lumped together as barbarians hundreds of different tribal groups under countless different chiefs in North and Eastern Europe. But where had they come from, and why, with the Vandals at the fore, did they arrive here at Mainz? The Roman books don't say. But today, using modern technology, I'm going to take a bird's eye view of Europe to try to work it out.
So in the Dark Ages, when people came from the east into Europe, which routes did they take? Migratory peoples coming from the Eurasian steppe had various routes of access into Europe. One is crossing at the mouth of the Danube and into what was northern Greece, centrally through the Moravian Gap, and then further west, reaching the Rhine and giving access to Gaul or northern France. These are rivers which are literally hundreds of metres across, or very fast flowing where they're narrower. It's not like today where you can simply drive across a well-kept bridge. These are significant geographical barriers and strategic blocking points.
When a Vandal arrived at this barrier at the beginning of the 5th century, he'd have been confronted not only by the river, but by the might of the Roman navy. The extent of the Roman fleet only became clear in the 1980s. It was while they were excavating by the banks of the Rhine that archaeologists realised the importance of some ancient timbers they'd found buried in the mud. This discovery showed that the Romans regarded the barbarian threat seriously enough to establish an extraordinary inland navy. The timbers have been precisely dated by the science of tree ring growth to the very last days of empire. These then were the ships which secured the barbarian front line. They patrolled the river twice a day between forts which had been built about 20 miles apart. This left the Vandals and their allies facing a formidable deterrent. But I wanted to know who it was who was pushing the Vandals and their allies against the frontier.
This is the model, the Huns pouring out of the Eurasian steppe and driving the more settled people before them, so they press up against the borders of the empire, eventually desperate to fight their way in.
The horse archer armies of the Huns could cover 1,500 miles in a week. They were different from the slow-moving migrant groups like the Vandals. The Huns darted westwards, harrying the more settled tribes, shunting them up against the frontier.
The crossing of the Rhine was obviously a difficult thing. It was a very heavily defended area. And on one famous occasion, on the last day of 406, a confederation led by the Vandals actually crossed the Rhine at Mainz when the river was frozen. So they walked dry-shod into the empire. And that was a crucial moment, really, of the breakdown of Roman authority north of the Alps.
So this then, on that cold winter's night in 406, is where the barbarians seized the moment. It's the place where two worlds collided. This was one of the defining moments of European history. The Dark Ages had begun. Only 2 years later, the scholar and historian St. Jerome described the result.
I shall now say a few words of our present miseries. Savage tribes in countless numbers have overrun all paths. The once noble city of Mainz has been captured and destroyed. In its church many thousands have been massacred, and those whom the sword spares without, famine ravages within. I cannot speak without tears.
There's no question the Vandals certainly raped and pillaged Mainz. But why did they do it? 1,500 years later, is it possible for me to work out what made them tick?
Most peoples who would invade the town or city of another people and stay there would want to keep it in some good shape, but you're saying they completely decimated it.
I think these wandering tribes had no inkling of what life in a town means, and so they had no idea that the town itself had some worth.
So if they didn't want the town, what did they want?
They wanted booty, I think, and fame. For these early Germanic tribes and people's fame was the dominating motive.
The Vandals wanted fame, and it was their booty, Roman gold, which reflects their desire for glory.
But what did they do with the gold?
They reworked it.
Oh, they made their own objects
refashioned,
out of the
refashioned
Roman
it
gold.
into ornaments of their own style.
So they had good craftsmen, or?
Yes, they had. They had. And the technical quality, they are perfect. And it's utterly astonishing that people could produce such wonderful ornaments without having a fixed workshop. They all had the same way of life, living on their wagons, and so being incredibly mobile, so to speak, carrying their state with them on their wagons.
To understand the barbarians, you have to adopt their mindset. Civilization doesn't have to mean living in stone buildings. It doesn't even have to mean living in cities. Tribes like the Vandals weren't looking to settle down. They carried their state with them. They moved slowly in huge numbers with their carts and their belongings. They sacked the city, they took what was valuable to them, and they moved on. They didn't need or want the aqueducts or amphitheatres. They weren't ignorant savages. They just valued different things from the Romans. It's been hard to find evidence of these transient people. But new clues to life in the Dark Ages do occasionally emerge. In Austria, archaeologists are studying one of the most important 5th century graveyards ever found. It's yielding tangible evidence about the way of life of these Dark Age people. But they've discovered something more. Some of the skulls are grossly misshapen. And the study of them reveals something quite unexpected about the beliefs and practices of the people who lived here. In this Dark Ages graveyard, I'm hoping to find clues to help me understand the most elusive of all the barbarians, the Huns. Archaeologists have found 166 skeletons here, and forensic anthropologist Maria Teschler has made a remarkable discovery. At least 3 of the bodies have misshapen heads. Compared to ordinary skulls, these were grossly deformed.
I would say this is the most impressive one. This is the skull of a young male, around 20 years of age, and this skull shows a very severe deformation.
This was no natural malformation. These skulls had been deformed during childhood, deliberately.
They used a tight bandage. We do not know about the material. Most probably it was leather or other material. And they started to do this deformation in a very early childhood, in the period shortly after the birth, because the bone is very soft in that time.
So if you tie it really tight across here, you can actually make the skull grow in a different way.
Yes.
But why would a parent do that to their own baby?
I think this is a Hun custom. and maybe the inhabitants here made a copy of this custom.
And why did they want to be like the Huns?
Because the Huns were powerful individuals, powerful people, and they tried to be like this.
This is the kind of evidence I need to help me to see the barbarians from a non-Roman point of view. To the people of that remote mountain valley, the most demonized barbarians of them all, the Huns, were not savages to be feared and despised. They were so glamorous and powerful that the community wanted to make their own children look like the Huns. Hungary, the country which that most famous of barbarians, Attila the Hun, notoriously called the Scourge of God, decided to use as his base.
The perplexing thing is that although we've all heard of Attila, the Huns themselves left remarkably few traces of their time in Europe. They're practically invisible. Almost all the archaeology they left is the dust and the charcoal of the cities they burned.
The Vandals at least left golden ornaments. The Huns, though, flashed through Europe like a comet through the sky and disappeared as suddenly as they arrived. But I'm on my way with anthropologist János Tari to meet a man who's devoted his life to searching for the Huns and who doesn't rely on Roman history. Finding out anything at all about the mysterious Huns obviously wasn't going to be easy.
És a régészeti anyag összekötése ez mindig problematikus.
It's a big problem all the time in archaeology to put together a nation with the kind of findings.
A csontvázak nem beszélnek.
Because the bones not speaking.
The bones not speaking, no.
Yes,
that's a big problem.
Peter Tomka was to guide me through the landscape of his nation's past.
Wow, Danube.
And using my Roman map, he placed Hungarian Pannonia in the ancient world.
So where did the Huns come from?
Huns come from
The other end.
Yes.
They come all the way.
Look.
They go down here. Pannonia.
That's Pannonia, yes.
After years of searching, he literally struck gold near his home in the provincial town of Győr in northwest Hungary, where he was to make an astonishing find.
This is good. This is good.
It was here he found a hoard of Dark Age treasure.
Ezen a vidéken
This
volt.
area was
This is the area.
excavation.
A discovery so rare it was to shed new light on this invisible people. It could only have belonged to a Hun.
It means they were here personally, the Huns were at this location.
The Huns were definitely here.
Yeah,
Definitely.
What was it that Peter Tomka found that was so convincing?
We'll show something which prove this is a Hun finding.
Okay.
Arany lemezzel borított szobrocskának a maradványa,
This is a golden covered little sculpture.
ami egy állat alakot.
That's an animal, not realistic,
So
yeah?
this is the ear and the head and the...
Ear, the head and the neck
somebody.
and the body here.
This beautiful object's true significance only became clear when Peter told me about similar discoveries. At last I could pin down the origin of these warriors.
Tárgyakat ismerünk.
They found similar
Ez
objects.
ugye a Kelet-Európa, tehát a kelet-európai
On a
pusztában
map, he explained to me that tiny golden sculptures of horses, just like this one, had been found in an arc which curved all the way from the reputed birthplace of the Huns in eastern Siberia to here in Hungary.
So these horses are like the kind of signposts of where the Huns travelled from Central Asia all the way to Hungary.
Yes, these are the proofs.
So for the first time, I found barbarian, not Roman, evidence. The Huns had moved from Asia to Europe. But there was something else. The next find symbolized the strength that lay at the heart of Hunnic culture.
And we find these.
Are these from a real Hun bow?
Yes.
It's a real Han bow parts.
Arany.
Now this is gold.
This is the Han golden decoration.
So all these parts were gold.
Ezek. Ezzel nem lehet egyetlen egy lövéssel leadni.
Yeah, it was a very special symbolic thing, he said, because it's impossible to shoot with this.
Különben leröpülnek
So
egy jelvény.
it wasn't actually used for shooting arrows.
It's with this golden bow, it's impossible to shoot.
So this is a bow that belonged to a leader of the Huns.
Ez az a bizonyos híres gold bow from the Huns.
So the bow that the Romans used because it was efficient, the Huns buried with their leaders. This bow was an expression of Hun identity. The golden bow wasn't even functional. It represented the power and status of its owner. The Huns didn't leave us towns or cities. They carried and buried their culture with them. The Huns had culture and skill, but to achieve their military success, they must also have had discipline and dedication. But what happened to Attila and his empire? With lightning strikes from their base in Hungary, they sacked many of the major cities of the Roman Empire. But to sustain their empire, they needed grass. In Hungary, they ran out of steppe. Then they vanished. Some must have changed their way of life and become absorbed into peasant society. Others must have returned to the east. But the biggest secret of these early Dark Ages lies with a people who didn't destroy a city and who weren't nomadic warriors. A people who conquered and then settled. They lived just like the Romans and left behind a glorious legacy, one which remained deliberately hidden for nearly 1,500 years. This is Ravenna in northern Italy. Today it's a quiet, picturesque city celebrated for its Byzantine legacy, the art and architecture created by the Eastern Roman Empire. Or was it? In fact, much of the glory of Ravenna is not Roman at all, but barbarian. Just as the Vandals had crossed over the Rhine, so another group, the Goths, had been pushed into the empire by the Huns. Here in Ravenna, the Goths took over the last capital of the Western Roman Empire. For 33 years under their king, Theodoric, it was the equal of any Roman capital. Theodoric renovated and reformed its institutions, improved and enhanced its splendor, and in a few short years created one of the wonders of the age. This would have been like walking through heaven's gates. If this had been an age of darkness, then here, without doubt, was a cathedral of light. This is Sant'Apollinare Nuovo, built by Theodoric nearly 1,500 years ago, one of the brightest jewels of the Dark Ages.
I I'd like you to look at the mosaics from this position. You can see that the background is shining, is reflecting the light from the windows because it was made of glass cubes and gold cubes, and the robes of the saints are dull, are opaque, because they were made using marble cubes, so as to give the impression of wool, of textiles.
These works were commissioned by Theodoric, the Gothic king. Yet most visitors today think they are Roman or Byzantine mosaics. Why should that be? Is it because we have all been conditioned to assume that work of this quality must be Roman? Perhaps there are other reasons. As I looked more closely, I began to wonder, why are there so many mosaic curtains in a scene of such splendour? And what do these hands, unattached to any bodies, signify? Could I learn the answers to these barbarian riddles in modern Ravenna? Mosaics are still being produced here in exactly the same way as they were in the Dark Ages. Only highly skilled workers could produce glass and marble with the desired effects of scattering or absorbing light. To a barbarian immigrant, the effect of turning tiny pieces like this into works of art must have seemed magical.
Can I cut one?
Can I cut?
Me?
Yes, if you want.
Okay.
Just a little. Okay.
Can you use this or not?
Yes, yes,
it's
I
a good
use.
shape?
I use.
Goes here.
No, here.
No?
It's better.
Oh, there, okay.
Okay.
These pieces, called tesserae, are cut and placed on a pattern which sometimes reveals itself only at a distance. Gold mosaic was made by placing gold leaf between layers of clear glass. It's a slow, costly and very secretive art, and it was only commissioned by the rich and powerful. Later rulers were no exception. Here's a copy of the famous portrait of Justinian, the Roman Byzantine emperor who ruled Ravenna after Theodoric. In Santa Pollinare, I wanted to see whether the mystery of the curtains was any clearer. I realise now that they reflect so much work that they must have had a very deliberate purpose. What were they supposed to represent?
This part of the mosaic that shows you the royal palace, all this mosaic was made and commissioned by Theodoric. This mosaic has been changed, altered. We could say that it has been vandalized by the Byzantines because some images have been destroyed. Those images that had portrayed Theodoric, members of his court, members of his clergy, and that stood between the columns, now they have been replaced with curtains. But you can still see the hands here. There is one hand here, another one here, another one here, and another hand here, and another hand here. And you can still see the halos here of the heads that have disappeared. All these elements tell us that previous images have been destroyed. It was an act of censorship, we could say.
Those who succeeded Theodoric deliberately left some traces of his presence, the hands on the pillars, to emphasize their own ability to destroy his barbarian kingdom. The returning empire was determined to banish the image of Theodoric from history altogether. But one rare image of him survives.
This is a medallion that was issued in the year 500, and it's the only image that we have of Theodoric, and maybe you can see a certain similarity with the mosaic.
There certainly is a similarity between Theodoric's face on the rare medallion and the image of Justinian I'd been working on. The medallion shows Theodoric without a crown and simply dressed. And recent research has proved that the crown and the brooch on Emperor Justinian's mosaic were added later, as was the name Justinian itself. Could it be that the mosaic face had once belonged to Theodoric? What would happen if you compared the images closely?
So they really airbrushed him out.
Yes, they airbrushed him out.
The returning Romans had felt so threatened by this evidence of a barbarian culture that they removed it. But they weren't able to disguise Theodoric's tomb, a confident statement of his barbarian origins.
This is one of the most important buildings we have in Ravenna. This is the mausoleum of Theodoric.
There are echoes of his early childhood on the plains of Eastern Europe. And to many, the shape of the roof resembles a yurt, the tent favoured by nomads from the east.
We know also that Theodoric came from a people, nomad people, but he lived in a palace during when we was in Ravenna, not in a tent.
Well, most people would choose to live in a palace, I think.
Yes.
Even a nomad.
So how did they build the mausoleum? Because some of this stoneworking seems very good to me.
Yes, it's very good, and there are no mortar for this building.
The vast dome of a roof was carved from a single piece of stone which was shipped across the Adriatic Sea from Istria in modern-day Croatia. Sauro found it on my map straight away.
This is the area where the stone come from for the mausoleum.
Ah, Styria.
Croatia.
This is Cyprus. Yes.
Cyprus.
And this is the Holy Land.
This is
Oh, there's River Ganges.
Ganges, yes.
Yes.
At the end of the world.
Yeah, where is the end of the world? Yeah.
Under Theodoric, the Goths established a kingdom that foreshadowed the shape of modern Italy. A first step towards the creation of modern Europe, perhaps. But what matters to me is not so much the extent of his power, but what he believed in. I'm travelling north now to one of the most dramatic examples of Theodoric's spiritual vision. The 5th century was a time of religious ferment, and Theodoric was an Arian Christian, not a Roman Catholic. Arians, like Theodoric, didn't believe in the Holy Trinity, could not accept the divinity of Christ. For the Catholic Church, this was heresy. This track in southern Austria once led to a walled city perched high in the mountains and long since vanished. It's a place where he protected both branches of Christianity and let them worship side by side. Side by side on the top of the mountain stand the ruins of 2 ancient churches. The Catholic Church on one side, and here, some 50 yards away, the Arian Church. As the 2 congregations worshipped, they must have heard each other's prayers. This just and civilized barbarian said once, "We cannot command the religion of our subjects, since no one can be forced to believe against their will." Here, as in Ravenna, the Goths displayed an extraordinary tolerance. A tolerance perhaps we wouldn't expect to find among barbarians, and a tolerance perhaps that we're lacking today. People still come here on pilgrimage, and though they are not honouring Theodoric's memory, it seems to me, of all the barbarians, he's the one we should remember. The barbarians have been dismissed as the Hell's Angels of history. For 1500 years we've had a one-sided view of them. I've discovered there is no one label that can be applied to the various tribes who took Europe from the Romans. The Vandals who breached the frontiers at Mainz simply valued different things and a different way of life. The Huns formed a military force which was able to rival and overpower the Romans, helped by a technology which was to change warfare for 1,000 years. More than that, they were a sophisticated and cultured people. The enlightened Gothic kingdom of Theodoric showed itself at least the equal of Rome, and in many ways its superior, especially in tolerance. This barbarian world so threatened the Romans that their historians and propagandists tried to erase it from history.